Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Arlington, Virginia. The Trump administration is promising more and yet harsher sanctions on Venezuela once again. The sanctions announcement came in two forms this week. First, from an unnamed government official speaking to reporters, who said that the new sanctions would be crippling and impactful measures, and that Trump instructed all parts of the US government to use all of the tools at their disposal to further create stress upon Maduro and his cronies. Then on Thursday, the Trump administration's special representative for Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, announced that, quote, Russians may soon find that their continued support of Maduro will no longer be cost-free. All of this comes on the heels of a very warm bipartisan reception that Venezuela's opposition leader and self-declared parallel president, Juan Guaido, received during Trump's State of the Union address on Tuesday.
Here this evening is a very brave man who carries with him the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of all Venezuelans. Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Mr. President, please take this message back to your homeland. Socialism destroys nations, but always remember freedom unifies the soul.
Joining me to analyze all of this is Guillaume Long. He is Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. Prior to joining CEPR, he held several cabinet positions in the government of Ecuador, including Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thanks for joining us again, Guillaume.
Thank you.
So let me start with the reception that Guaido received in Congress on Tuesday, where Trump clearly linked Venezuela's economic crisis to socialism. Now, this was part of his larger dig against socialism as a concept, but also against some members of Congress, particularly presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who calls himself a democratic socialist. And then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi also gave Guaido a warm reception on Wednesday. We have a clip here of her and Guaido.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was a great honor to welcome to the Capitol what we consider to be the president of Venezuela. We were all thrilled that he was at the State of the Union address the other day and received such an overwhelming bipartisan welcome to the Capitol. We believe that the plight of the people of Venezuela is a challenge to the conscience of the world, and we will all stay with you, Mr. President, in that fight.
So what do you make of this bipartisan support for Guaido, who Trump and others call the legitimate president of Venezuela, but who does not actually control anything in Venezuela? Why do you think Pelosi and Trump, despite their animosity towards each other, which was on display at the State of the Union speech, why do they find so much agreement on this issue?
Well, I think this has to do with a broader trend in US politics and a general consensus between Democrats and Republicans on foreign policy. There hasn't been a fundamental break in foreign policy, I would say, in the world, but certainly towards Latin America, between different administrations in the United States. And what some people call liberal internationalism, what I maybe would call liberal imperialism, very much applies to many Democrats, particularly right-wing Democrats, to call them that. And so I'm not really surprised. I mean, if you think of Venezuela in particular, it was President Obama who first started raising the stakes and trying to isolate Venezuela, declaring it Venezuela an issue of a threat to U.S. national security in 2015, and that eventually that got the ball rolling for sanctions in August 2017, and then again in January 2018. And so it's grown and it's gone in crescendo, but it actually started during the Obama administration. So I'm not particularly surprised there. And as you said, I think Venezuela plays a role in domestic politics. It has done in Latin America for years now. It's been brandished by the right to try and attack the left because Venezuela has been struggling economically now for several years, particularly so since the sanctions have been heightened. And therefore, it's a useful tool to attack the left. It's been done in Latin America. It's been done in Europe. The left in Europe has been systematically attacked look at socialism and its failures in Venezuela. This is what you want to do, and so on and so forth. Is a common recurrent discourse, and it's clearly going to be done during this presidential campaign in the United States.
Well, yeah, that's what I wanted to turn to next, is actually the role of the sanctions. That is, as I mentioned, Trump has announced a new round of sanctions, and it's kind of an open question as to what else can be sanctioned, considering that there's basically an economic blockade going on against Venezuela at the moment. And these sanctions, as we've mentioned, have dealt a crippling blow against Venezuelan economy. But they've actually not worked. I mean, that is in terms of their stated goal of getting rid of Maduro and forcing him to resign. So I guess the question is also, you mentioned that's already some of the issues that perhaps, there's other reasons for the sanctions. Also considering that, U.S. companies seem to have received some exemptions. I was wondering if you could say more about that, as to what the different reasons could be for these sanctions and the effect that they're having on the Venezuelan economy.
Yeah, so I agree that essentially, I think the sanctions. The exercise this week is essentially rhetorical. I agree with you. I don't see how they can significantly increase the aggressiveness of these sanctions. The current sanctions on Venezuela are extremely aggressive. They're crippling the economy. Actually, CIPA, the organization I work for, published a paper on the effect of the sanctions that were implemented after August 2017, and how those in 2017 and 2018 had probably caused 40,000 deaths in Venezuela. Now, since January 2019, we have an extra layer of sanctions, and we haven't yet got a clear idea of the exact number of victims. We have a general idea of its effect on health care, on social provisions, on the immigration crisis, which has affected the region as a whole. Venezuelans leaving their country to look for jobs and for some stability elsewhere, so on and so forth. So these sanctions have been, as often U.S. sanctions are, very cruel, very hurtful, very socially harmful, completely illegal, of course. It's important to remember that they contravene international law. These are not UN sanctions. They're unilateral coercive economic measures. And I can't see that whatever the rumor is about intensifying them, how that would change the situation. Is certainly sanctions have failed so far to achieve regime change, and I don't think they're going to succeed in changing the regime henceforth. So I think the main reason is for domestic politics. So U.S. politics. We've seen the attack on socialism, bringing Venezuela always back into the national debate, and I actually think it is going to play a big role for President Trump's re-election bid and his system of alliances in Florida with people like Marco Rubio, with the Cuban emigre community, with the Venezuelan emigre community. Whether that is a good electoral calculation or not is a different issue, because I think the Venezuelan issue does not work throughout the Latino community in the United States. But I think it's clearly a part of his pattern of alliances within the Republican Party, and particularly with people such as Marco Rubio and so on.
Yeah. I think also, of course, the Democrats are probably playing a part in that effort to win over the Latino vote, and therefore you see Nancy Pelosi supporting that policy, aside from the issue that you mentioned earlier about the bipartisan nature of foreign policy. But I want to move also to the issue of how people in Latin America are reacting to this. That is, many right-wing and conservative governments right now in Latin America are actually supporting U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela. But that's not necessarily the same as kind of the general sense among the intellectuals and among the people who are aware of what's happening in terms of U.S. policy towards Venezuela. How do you think it's being received more generally? That is, with Latin American history of suspicion towards U.S. foreign policy, and particularly the rejection of the Monroe Doctrine, which claims that the U.S. has the right to intervene anywhere in Latin America. How do you see this policy being received, let's say, behind the scenes in Latin America?
So specifically with some of the right-wing governments in Latin America, many of them have recognized the Guaido government and are kind of aligned with the United States on the policy towards Venezuela. But over the last few months, we've seen a number of right-wing governments getting colder feet, I would say, with regards to them being more cautious. At the beginning, the group of Lima was very aggressive, and they were hoping to, have a swift, to be successful quickly, to have regime change in Venezuela quickly. This didn't happen. And we're seeing little by little a number of countries within the Lima group sort of being a little bit more cautious, because at the end of the day, if you recognize Guaido and you don't have any type of diplomatic relations with the Maduro government, this is also problematic. You can't negotiate a number of things, including with regards to immigration of Venezuelans we were talking about. There's just been a high-profile case of a Colombian criminal who's former congresswoman who's sought refuge in Venezuela, and the president of Colombia, Duque, wrote a letter to Guaido to hand her over. I mean, it's incredibly ironical, verging on surreal, given that Guaido doesn't control the sovereignty, the institutions, the judiciary, the penitentiary. I mean, there's no institutional hold on behalf of this Guaido sort of shadow government that's recognized by some, and obviously Guaido is incapable of handing over this person wanted by Colombia. So, we're in a surreal world where the recognition of Guaido on behalf of a number of Latin American countries and not of Maduro is creating problems for these Latin American governments, which is why you're seeing the new right-wing government, elected government of Uruguay, saying, hey, we're not going to go down that road because it's not helpful. And also a few governments on sort of center-left, on the progressive side of things, having been elected in the last year or so Mexico first, and now Argentina, moving away from the Lima group, its policies, and from recognizing Guaido. And given that within Venezuela, Guaido is not getting any more support, even the Venezuelan opposition has sort of taken its distance from Guaido, that has an impact on the rest of Latin America. Now, that's on the right-wing governments, but generally speaking, I think all these policies that we're seeing on behalf of the United States under the Trump administration, they're very aggressive policies, they're very right-wing policies. They're supporting regime change in Venezuela, and we've just seen it now. They supported effective regime change in Bolivia. This alliance with the far right, including with the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, and so on and so forth. And this return to what you call Monroeism, which is treating Latin America as its backyard, is going to have sooner or later a boomerang effect. It's exactly what caused the pink tide in the first place. This kind of victorious hegemony of the United States in the 90s, imposing neoliberalism and a very sort of imperial approach to that region, caused a leftist backlash, a pro-sovereignty backlash, if you like. And I think eventually, where democracy is given a chance, and there's a democratic deficit right now in Latin America, but where democracy is given a chance, you're going to see progressive governments of different forms, and not all as radical as each other. Some will be more moderate, whatever, but progressive governments come back to power, and that will have consequences on the US's interests in the region, on the US's relationship. I think it's a grave mistake on behalf of the United States to apply this really hawkish, imperial return of the fist in the region, imposing all sorts of pro-Washington regimes. I think it's going to have a backlash, and probably sooner rather than later.
Well, I think that's a really good point, but we're going to have to leave it there. I was speaking to Guillaume Long, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. Thanks again, Guillaume, for having joined us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.